The Battle of Fort Sumter is considered the first battle of the American Civil War. It took place in April 1861 and marked the beginning of a long and bloody conflict between the northern states, the Union, and the southern states, the Confederacy. Though the battle itself lasted only a few days, it had a major impact on the course of American history. By 1860, the United States was divided over the issue of slavery. The northern states, where slavery was illegal, were more industrialized, while the southern states depended on slavery for their agricultural economy. Tensions between the North and South had been building for years, and after Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, several southern states decided to secede from the Union. This meant they chose to leave the United States and form their own government, known as the Confederate States of America. One of the major issues that caused tension between the North and South was the status of federal property in the South. There were military bases and forts in the southern states that were owned by the U.S. government. One of the most important of these was Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was a key location, and both the Union and the Confederacy wanted control over it. After South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860, it demanded that the Union give up control of Fort Sumter. The commander of the fort, Major Robert Anderson, refused to surrender. At the time, Fort Sumter had a small number of Union soldiers stationed there, and it was not well defended, but it still held great symbolic value for both sides. In early 1861, the Confederacy, now led by President Jefferson Davis, began to strengthen its position around the fort. The Confederates saw Fort Sumter as a symbol of Union control in the South, and they wanted to take it over. The Union, led by President Abraham Lincoln, did not want to give up the fort because it was located in a seceded state, and abandoning it would show weakness. On April 11, 1861, the Confederate forces, led by Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, demanded that Major Anderson surrender Fort Sumter. Anderson refused, knowing that giving up the fort would be seen as an act of submission to the Confederacy. The next day, on April 12th, the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter, starting the battle. For 34 hours, the Confederates bombarded the fort with heavy artillery. The Union soldiers inside the fort fought back, but their weapons were not powerful enough to cause serious damage to the Confederate positions. As the bombardment continued, the fort's defenders were forced to retreat to a stronger position. By the afternoon of April 13th, Major Anderson was forced to surrender Fort Sumter to the Confederacy. Though the Battle of Fort Sumter itself was small and lasted only 2 days, it had a major impact on the United States. First, the Confederacy's victory at Fort Sumter gave them control of a key military base. More importantly, the battle marked the start of the Civil War. After the Union soldiers surrendered, the Confederacy saw it as a sign that they had successfully defended their new nation, while the Union saw the attack as an act of rebellion that could not be ignored. The fall of Fort Sumter led President Lincoln to call for 75,000 volunteers to join the Union Army. This call for troops was a signal that the North was prepared to fight to preserve the Union and put down the rebellion in the South. In response, many more Southern states, including Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy. The Battle of Fort Sumter was just the beginning of a war that would last for 4 more years, with devastating losses on both sides. The Civil War would become a struggle over not only the future of slavery, but also the survival of the United States as one nation. In the end, the Union emerged victorious, and slavery was abolished, but the war caused tremendous suffering, with over 600,000 soldiers and civilians losing their lives. Fort Sumter, however, remains an important symbol in American history. Today, Fort Sumter National Monument stands at the site of the battle in Charleston Harbor, reminding visitors of the conflict that shaped the nation's future. The Battle of Fort Sumter was a small but significant event in American history. It was the spark that started the Civil War, a conflict that would change the United States forever. Though the battle itself was not large, it set in motion a series of events that would lead to the end of slavery, the preservation of the Union, and a new era for America. The American Civil War, one of the most pivotal moments in U.S. history, began in April 1861. Both the Union and the Confederacy knew that a war of this scale would shape the future of the country. But the first major battle that would truly show how brutal and long this war would be was the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Battle of Manassas. In today's video, we'll take an in-depth look at this crucial battle, the events leading up to it, the key players involved, and the lasting impact it had on both the Union and the Confederacy. To understand the First Battle of Bull Run, we need to go back to the beginning. After the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This marked the official start of the Civil War. By mid-1861, the Union and Confederate forces were mobilizing for the first major confrontation. The Union Army, under General Irvin McDowell, had been ordered to march south from Washington, D.C., and confront the Confederate Army in northern Virginia. The Confederacy, led by General P.G.T. Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston, prepared to defend their capital, Richmond, Virginia. The Union's goal was to quickly crush the rebellion and end the war before it could fully escalate. They believed that if they could defeat the Confederates near Washington, D.C., it would demoralize the South and force them to surrender. But the Confederacy, though outnumbered, was determined to defend their land and their cause. The Union Army, under McDowell, had about 35,000 soldiers. They faced a Confederate force of about 25,000 men, commanded by General Beauregard. Although the Confederacy was smaller in numbers, they had an advantage in the terrain and had more experienced commanders, including General Stonewall Jackson, who would soon make a name for himself. The stage was set for a battle near a small stream called Bull Run, just outside the town of Manassas, Virginia. On July 21, 1861, the two armies met on the fields of Bull Run. The Union forces, confident of an easy victory, moved forward with plans to strike the Confederates hard and fast. However, things quickly started to go wrong for the Union. The Confederates, although initially pushed back, managed to rally and counterattack. The battle began in the morning with intense fighting along the banks of Bull Run. The Union troops made some early gains, capturing important positions like the Confederate artillery and pushing them back. However, the Confederate forces quickly reorganized and sent reinforcements under General Johnston, who had marched from the Shenandoah Valley to support Beauregard. This is where things took a turn for the worse for the Union. One of the key moments that would turn the tide of the battle came when General Thomas J. Jackson, a Confederate commander, and his troops arrived on the battlefield. His men had just marched a long distance, but Jackson quickly took control of a crucial position on Henry Hill, rallying his troops and giving them the strength to hold their ground. This is when Jackson earned his famous nickname, Stonewall. As he stood firm in the face of Union pressure, he became a symbol of Confederate resolve. The Union soldiers, who had been fighting hard all day, began to lose their momentum. With Jackson's stand and the arrival of more Confederate reinforcements, the Union forces began to falter. In the heat of battle, the Union commanders lost control, and panic spread through the ranks. By the afternoon, the Union soldiers were in full retreat. The Confederates, now led by Jackson and Beauregard, chased them back to Washington, D.C., marking a stunning victory for the South. The aftermath of the battle was devastating. The Union suffered about 2,900 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing soldiers. The Confederacy lost around 2,000. But despite the heavy toll, the Confederate victory was a significant blow to the Union war effort. This unexpected outcome shocked both the North and the South. Many in the North had believed the war would be quick and relatively painless. But after the chaos of Bull Run, it became clear that the war would not end easily. For the Confederacy, the victory at Bull Run boosted morale and strengthened their resolve. However, it did not lead to a decisive end to the war. Despite the win, the South still lacked the resources and manpower to sustain a long conflict. On the Union side, President Abraham Lincoln recognized the need to reorganize and better train his army. The Union would have to rethink its strategies and prepare for a war of attrition, one that would stretch over several years. In the aftermath of the battle, Lincoln replaced McDowell with General George B. McClellan, who would soon take charge of the Union Army. McClellan was known for his cautious approach, which would both help and hinder the Union cause in the coming years. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the earliest and most important battles of the American Civil War. It took place in April 1862, in a small area near a church called Shiloh, in southwestern Tennessee. The battle lasted for 2 days, April 6th and 7th, and it had a huge impact on both the Union and the Confederate forces. Though the Union won the battle, it came at a high cost, with heavy casualties on both sides. This essay will discuss the events that led to the Battle of Shiloh, what happened during the battle, and its significance in the Civil War. In the early years of the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy were trying to gain control of key locations in the southern states. One of the most important regions was the Mississippi River and its surrounding areas. Control of this river would allow either side to move troops and supplies more easily, and cut off the other side's resources. In early 1862, Union General Ulysses S. Grant was making progress in the western theater of the war. After capturing Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, Grant's army was moving southward, aiming to take control of more Confederate territory. His next target was the Confederate stronghold at Corinth, Mississippi. To reach it, he needed to move through the area around Shiloh. At the same time, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston and his army were trying to stop the Union advance. They decided to strike first, hoping to surprise Grant's army and defeat them before they could reach Corinth. On the morning of April 6th, the Confederates launched a surprise attack on Grant's army, which was camped near Shiloh Church. The Union soldiers were caught off guard, and the Confederates pushed them back. The Confederates were led by General Johnston, and they fought with great determination, hoping to break the Union lines and win the battle. At first, the Confederate attack seemed to be successful. The Union troops, who were not prepared for such an aggressive assault, were pushed back, and their camp was thrown into chaos. Many Union soldiers were killed or wounded in the early stages of the battle. General Grant, however, was able to rally his forces and reorganize his troops. Despite being pushed back, the Union soldiers fought hard to hold their ground. Grant called for reinforcements, and by the end of the first day the Union Army was holding on to important positions, but they had suffered significant losses. On the second day of the battle, the Union received reinforcements from General Don Carlos Buell's army, which had been marching to help Grant. With the extra soldiers, the Union forces were able to push the Confederates back. General Johnston, the Confederate leader, was killed during the battle, and this was a huge blow to the Confederate army. With their leader gone and the Union reinforcements arriving, the Confederates began to lose ground. They fought fiercely, but they could not stop the Union Army from taking back the positions they had lost. By the end of the day, the Confederates were forced to retreat. The Union Army had won the Battle of Shiloh, but at a heavy cost. The Battle of Shiloh was one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War up to that point. The Union Army suffered about 13,047 casualties, including 1,754 killed, 8,408 wounded, 2,885 missing or captured, and 2,885 wounded. The Confederates had about 10,699 casualties, including 1,728 killed, 8,012 wounded, 959 missing or captured, and 2,885 wounded. The high number of casualties shocked both the North and the South. Many people had expected the war to be over quickly, but the Battle of Shiloh made it clear that the conflict would be long, brutal, and deadly. The battle demonstrated the power of modern warfare and the terrible cost of the Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh had a major impact on the Civil War. For the Union, the victory was important because it allowed them to continue their campaign in the western part of the war. After Shiloh, General Grant was able to capture Corinth, Mississippi, which was an important railroad and supply center for the Confederacy. This gave the Union more control over the Mississippi River region, which was a key strategic area. However, the battle also showed the Union that the Confederacy was not going to give up easily. The high number of casualties and the fierce fighting made it clear that the war would be much harder and longer than many people had hoped. Both sides realized that the Civil War was not just about winning battles, but also about facing difficult and costly challenges. For the Confederacy, the loss at Shiloh was a blow to their army, but it did not end the war for them. Even though they were defeated, they continue. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, was one of the most important and bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. It took place near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek, between the Union Army, led by General George McClellan, and the Confederate Army, commanded by General Robert E. Lee. The battle is significant for its high number of casualties, its impact on the war's direction, and its role in shaping the future of the United States. By the summer of 1862, the Civil War had been raging for over a year. The Union had been struggling to make significant progress in the Eastern Theater, where General Robert E. Lee was leading the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Lee had already achieved several victories against Union forces, including the 7 Days Battles and the Second Battle of Bull Run. In the summer of 1862, after his success at the Second Battle of Bull Run, General Lee decided to take the war to the north. His plan was to invade Maryland, which was a border state, and gain a victory on Union soil. Lee hoped this would boost Southern morale, bring European countries closer to recognizing the Confederacy, and possibly convince Northern politicians to negotiate for peace. Meanwhile, the Union Army, commanded by General George McClellan, was preparing to defend the northern states. McClellan had a large army, but he was known for being overly cautious. When Lee's army began moving into Maryland, McClellan was determined to stop them and bring the war to a decisive end. On September 16, 1862, the armies met near Antietam Creek. General McClellan's Union forces numbered about 87,164 men, while General Lee's Confederate Army had around 38,000 soldiers. The battle began early in the morning on September 17, 1862, and would continue for the entire day. The Union Army launched attacks on the Confederate positions in several areas. The battle was fought in 3 main phases: the North Woods, the Cornfield, and the Sunken Road, also known as Bloody Lane. In the early hours of the battle, the Union forces attacked the Confederates in the North Woods, where they encountered strong resistance. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Union forces then advanced toward a large cornfield, where the battle became even more chaotic. Soldiers from both sides fought in the corn, sometimes only a few feet apart, and the area quickly became known as the Cornfield of Death. By the middle of the day, the Union soldiers had pushed the Confederate forces back, but they had not yet broken through the Confederate line. General Lee quickly sent reinforcements to hold his position. As the battle moved to the sunken road, the Union forces attacked again, but they were met with strong resistance. The Confederate soldiers held their ground in the sunken road, turning it into a deadly killing field. The area became known as Bloody Lane, due to the large number of dead and wounded soldiers. By late afternoon, both sides were exhausted, and neither had gained a clear victory. The Union forces had made some gains, but they were not able to completely defeat the Confederate Army. General Lee, realizing that his army was being stretched thin, decided to withdraw during the night and retreat back to Virginia. Although the battle was tactically indecisive, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, it was a strategic victory for the Union. General McClellan had successfully stopped Lee's invasion of the North and forced him to retreat. However, many believed that McClellan missed an opportunity to deliver a crushing blow to Lee's army, as his forces had not been able to completely destroy the Confederate troops. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle in American history. The Union Army suffered around 12,401 casualties, including 2,108 killed, 9,540 wounded, 753 missing, and 2,885 captured. The Confederate Army lost about 10,318 soldiers, including 1,546 killed, 7,752 wounded, and 1,023 missing or captured. Both sides endured enormous losses, and the battlefield was littered with the dead and wounded. In the aftermath of the battle, President Abraham Lincoln took a significant step. The Union victory at Antietam gave him the confidence he needed to announce the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. This proclamation declared that all slaves in Confederate-held territory would be freed. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the nature of the war, making the abolition of slavery a central goal of the Union war effort. It also discouraged European nations from supporting the Confederacy, as many European countries had already abolished slavery and were unlikely to support a nation that fought to preserve it. Lee's invasion of the North and the battle provided President Lincoln with the opportunity to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, which would change the course of the war and the nation's history.